There is a particular kind of trust that is almost impossible to withdraw once it has been given. The trust a sick person places in the hands of the man who tells them he knows how to help. It is not a rational trust exactly. It cannot be, because the person giving it is rarely in a position to verify the claims being made. It is something older than rationality, something closer to necessity. When you are suffering, and someone tells you they can end the suffering, you believe them because the alternative, that no one can help you, that the suffering will continue or worsen without remedy, is almost unbearable to hold in mind. On the American frontier, this trust was extended freely, repeatedly, and with consequences that were, by any honest accounting, frequently catastrophic. The man who arrived in a frontier settlement calling himself a doctor was not necessarily lying. Many of them had genuine credentials, certificates from medical schools, apprenticeships under established physicians, real experience with the treatments of their era. The problem was not, in most cases, that these men were frauds. The problem was something considerably more disturbing than fraud. The problem was that what they knew, what the best trained, most credentialed, most experienced physicians of the mid-19th century knew, was in many respects worse than nothing. Not neutral, not insufficient. Worse, the treatments they had been taught, the interventions they applied with genuine confidence and genuine intention to help, were in a significant number of cases directly harmful to the patients who received them. And the frontier, with its distance from any oversight, any competition, any mechanism for correcting error, gave these men unlimited freedom to practice what they had learned. The graves along the frontier trails and beside the frontier settlements hold many people who died of the diseases they contracted. They hold a number, difficult to count but impossible to ignore, who were killed by the treatments they received. This is not a comfortable history, but it is an instructive one. To understand what happened in the examination rooms and at the bedsides of frontier medicine, it is necessary to understand what medicine itself looked like in the middle of the 19th century, not as its practitioners understood it, but as it actually was. The germ theory of disease, the understanding that specific illnesses are caused by specific microorganisms that can be identified, targeted, and killed, was not established as scientific consensus until the 1860s and 1870s, through the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Before that, the dominant framework for understanding disease was something called miasma theory, the belief that illness was caused by bad air arising from rotting organic matter, swamps, and other sources of putrefaction. This theory was wrong. Comprehensively, consequentially wrong, and the treatments that grew from it were wrong in proportion to how wrong the theory was. If disease came from bad air and internal imbalance, then the treatments that made sense were the ones that addressed air and imbalance. Bleeding the patient, removing blood from the body, was believed to reduce the internal imbalance that made the body susceptible to disease. Purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea with powerful chemical agents, was believed to expel the poisons that bad air had introduced. Sweating the patient, restricting their food and water, applying poultices and blistering agents to the skin. These were all attempts to restore the balance that disease had disrupted, derived from a framework that had no relationship to the actual mechanisms of illness. A frontier doctor trained in the best American medical school of 1850 had been taught all of these treatments. He had been taught them systematically by men who believed in them, who had used them for decades, who had watched patients recover and attributed the recovery to the treatment rather than to the patient's own immune system working despite the treatment. He arrived on the frontier carrying a medical bag full of instruments and compounds that represented the best current practice of his profession. And the best current practice of his profession was, in a significant number of clinical situations, a direct contribution to patient death. The bleeding of patients, phlebotomy, deserves particular examination because it was perhaps the most widespread single harmful practice in 19th century medicine, and because the story of how it persisted so long contains a lesson that extends well beyond the history of medicine. The theoretical basis for bleeding was ancient, tracing back to the Greek physician Galen and his theory of the four humors. Blood was one of the four humors, and disease was understood as the result of humoral imbalance. Removing blood, sometimes in quantities that would today be considered frankly dangerous, was meant to restore balance and allow the body to heal. This theory was wrong, but for nearly 2,000 years, no one could demonstrate that it was wrong in a way that changed medical practice. The reason is instructive. When a physician bled a patient and the patient recovered, the physician credited the bleeding. When a physician bled a patient and the patient died, the physician concluded that the bleeding had been insufficient or too late, or that the disease had been too advanced. The theory was, in other words, structured in a way that made it immune to disconfirmation. Every outcome could be interpreted as consistent with the theory, and so the theory persisted, generation after generation, killing patients who would have recovered without it, and failing to save patients who died of the blood loss itself. On the frontier, where a physician worked alone and in isolation, where there was no colleague to question his methods, no case records that anyone would review, no mechanism for comparing outcomes across practitioners, this dynamic operated without any break at all. A frontier doctor could bleed every patient he saw for 20 years and never encounter a professional context in which his outcomes were examined and his methods questioned. He would see recoveries and attribute them to treatment. He would see deaths and attribute them to disease. And he would continue. This was not malice. This was the human tendency to see what confirms existing beliefs and to explain away what contradicts them. A tendency that is neither unique to doctors nor unique to the 19th century, but that the frontier setting allowed to operate without the corrective pressure of scrutiny or accountability. There is a man named Dr. John Brinkley, whose story, while it belongs to a slightly later era of frontier medicine, captures the pattern so precisely that it is worth dwelling on. Brinkley was not a trained physician. He purchased his medical diploma from a diploma mill and built a practice in rural Kansas in the early 20th century that attracted patients from across the region. He was charming, confident, and completely sincere in his belief that his treatments worked. He charged substantial fees and accumulated substantial wealth. He also, by any honest accounting, caused the deaths of a significant number of patients who came to him in good faith. But Brinkley is an easy case, because he was a fraud. The harder cases, the ones that illuminate the deeper problem, are the trained physicians who killed their patients with treatments that their own profession endorsed. There's a physician named Benjamin Rush who was one of the most celebrated doctors in early American history. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He was a professor of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He was brilliant, dedicated, and genuinely committed to the well-being of his patients. During the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1793, he treated patients with a regimen of aggressive bleeding and purging that many historians now believe significantly worsened the mortality rate of those who came under his care. He bled patients of up to 4/5 of their blood volume, quantities that would cause shock and death in a healthy person, let alone one already weakened by disease. He believed with complete sincerity that he was saving lives. His outcomes suggested otherwise. He continued, "Rush is important not because he was unusually bad, but because he was unusually good. One of the best physicians of his era, doing what the best physicians of his era did. If the best could cause this kind of harm, what was happening in the hands of the frontier practitioners who had received less training, less supervision, and who were operating in conditions of complete isolation from any professional accountability? The frontier created specific conditions that amplified the dangers of bad medicine in ways that a settled urban medical practice would not have. The first was distance. A patient who was dissatisfied with a physician in Philadelphia could consult another physician. A patient who was dissatisfied with the only physician within 100 miles had no such option. The frontier doctor had a captive patient population, not through coercion but through geography. And captive populations cannot exercise the competitive pressure that, in functioning markets, eventually tends to eliminate the worst practitioners. The second was credential verification. In an eastern city, a physician's reputation could be checked, his training verified, his results observed by colleagues and competitors. On the frontier, a man who said he was a doctor was, for most practical purposes, a doctor. There was no mechanism for verification and no one with the authority or the information to challenge the claim. This created conditions in which the fraud and the genuine practitioner were, from the patient's perspective, largely indistinguishable, and in which even the genuine practitioner was under no external pressure to question his methods or update his practices. The third was urgency. Frontier conditions produced medical emergencies with particular frequency and particular severity. Accident injuries in rough terrain, infections and wounds that could not be properly cleaned, childbirth without adequate assistance, diseases that spread rapidly through communities without immunity, snakebite, frostbite, dysentery from contaminated water sources. These were not conditions that allowed for careful deliberation or cautious waiting. They demanded action, and the action that was demanded was typically the action the physician had been trained to take, which was, in a significant number of cases, the wrong action. The urgency of frontier medicine gave bad treatments a kind of cover that they did not fully deserve. When a patient died quickly, it was easy to attribute the death to the speed and severity of the illness rather than to the treatment. When a patient survived despite a harmful treatment, the treatment received credit that it had not earned. The feedback loop that might, given enough time and enough cases and enough honest accounting, have led a thoughtful physician to question his methods was consistently disrupted by the pace and urgency of frontier medical practice. The women who serve frontier communities as midwives and informal healers occupy a complicated position in this history, one that is worth examining honestly rather than romanticizing. On one hand, many of the treatments practiced by trained male physicians were genuinely more harmful than the folk remedies and supportive care that experienced midwives provided. A woman who had attended 200 births over 30 years, who knew what normal labor looked like and what complications required intervention, who provided pain relief, encouragement, physical support, and the basic care of keeping a patient warm and hydrated. This woman was in many specific situations a better medical resource than a credentialed physician applying the interventionist treatments he had been taught. On the other hand, folk medicine on the frontier contained its own errors and its own harmful practices. Herbal treatments that were ineffective or actively toxic, beliefs about fever management that led to keeping patients dangerously hot when cooling would have helped them. Dietary restrictions applied to sick people who needed nutrition. The absence of formal training was not, by itself, a guarantee of safety. It simply replaced one set of errors with a different set. What the best of the informal healers had, and what the worst of the trained physicians lacked, was a genuine attentiveness to what was actually happening with the patient in front of them. The ability to observe, adjust, respond to the specific individual, rather than applying a protocol regardless of how the patient was responding to it. This quality, call it clinical humility, or attentiveness, or simply the willingness to let the patient's response inform the treatment, was not the exclusive property of either trained medicine or folk tradition. But on the frontier, where formal training often meant confidence in harmful protocols, it was frequently more available in the cabin of an experienced midwife than in the office of a credentialed physician. There is a particular story that appears in several forms across the historical record of frontier medicine, varying in its details but consistent in its essential structure. A family travels west on the overland trail. The father becomes sick. Cholera, or typhoid, or one of the other intestinal diseases that were the great killers of the trail. A physician, either traveling with the party or encountered at a fort or trading post, treats the patient with the standard interventions of the era: purging, bleeding, restricted fluids. Cholera kills through dehydration. The body loses fluids at a rate that the heart cannot sustain. The treatment for cholera, the treatment that modern medicine uses, that is so simple it can be administered by a person with no medical training at all, is fluid replacement. Give the patient water. Give the patient water with a small amount of salt and sugar to aid absorption. Keep giving it. The body will do the rest, if there is enough time and enough fluid. The standard frontier medical treatment for cholera did the opposite. It purged additional fluids from an already dangerously dehydrated body. It bled additional fluid from a circulatory system that was struggling to maintain pressure. It restricted the water intake that was the patient's only real chance. The physician who did these things was not a murderer. He was a man applying the best available knowledge of his time to a patient who desperately needed help. The best available knowledge of his time happened to be, in this specific case, a prescription for accelerated death. The patient died. The physician recorded the death as a consequence of the disease. The family buried their father or their husband or their son at the side of the trail and continued west. The physician moved on to the next patient. This happened many times. No one who was in a position to stop it understood that it needed to be stopped. The question of what could have been done differently, what a more careful practitioner, a more observant one, a more genuinely humble one might have done differently, is worth asking, because the answer reveals something important about the nature of practical wisdom in any high-stakes field. There were physicians on the frontier who were better than the average, not dramatically better in their formal training, but better in a specific and observable way. They paid attention to outcomes. They noticed when a treatment did not seem to be helping. They were willing to stop doing something that appeared to be making the patient worse. even if that something was endorsed by their training. They were willing to try supportive care, hydration, rest, warmth, nutrition, in cases where the aggressive interventions of formal medicine seemed to be doing harm. These physicians were not typically the most credentialed. They were not the graduates of the best schools or the men with the most impressive medical vocabularies. They were the ones who had developed, through experience and honest self-observation, a genuine respect for the complexity of the human body and a genuine skepticism about the completeness of their own knowledge. One such physician, whose journals survive in a collection at a university archive, wrote something in the late 1850s that captures this quality with unusual precision. He wrote that he had gradually come to understand that the most dangerous moment in a physician's practice was not when he did not know what to do. It was when he was certain he knew what to do and was wrong. Uncertainty, he wrote, made a man cautious. Certainty made him lethal. This observation, made by a frontier doctor riding between isolated settlements on the American plains in the middle of the 19th century, has not aged at all. It remains one of the most accurate descriptions of how expertise becomes dangerous that anyone has ever written. The patent medicine industry that flourished across the frontier in the second half of the 19th century represents a different dimension of the same problem, and one that is, in some ways, even more instructive. Patent medicines, bottled remedies with impressive names and improbable claims sold by traveling salesmen and through mail-order catalogs and at general stores across the West, were not as a category the crude frauds that history has sometimes made them out to be. Some of them contained active ingredients that had genuine physiological effects. Laudanum, a preparation of opium dissolved in alcohol, was effective at suppressing pain. Cocaine-based preparations were effective at producing feelings of energy and well-being. Alcohol itself, which was an ingredient in a significant number of patent medicines, had genuine sedative properties. The problem was not that these preparations had no effect. The problem was that their effects were not the effects claimed, and that the effects they did have were frequently addictive, harmful over time, or dangerous in combination with the illnesses they were supposed to treat. A frontier family that purchased a bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup to calm a teething infant was giving that infant a preparation containing morphine. The infant became quiet. The parents concluded that the medicine had worked. They purchased more. The mechanism by which it produced its effect, opioid sedation, was not disclosed on the label. The cumulative risk of repeated administration was not mentioned. The possibility that a sick or underweight infant might respond with respiratory depression might, in short, be killed by the medicine was not discussed anywhere in the marketing materials. This was not an isolated case. It was the standard commercial practice of an industry that operated on the frontier in a context of complete regulatory absence. There was no Food and Drug Administration. There were no labeling requirements. There was no mechanism by which a preparation that was killing people could be identified as such and removed from sale. The feedback between harm and correction, which in a functioning regulatory environment tends to eliminate the most dangerous products from the market, simply did not exist. The people who sold these preparations were, many of them, sincere. They believed the testimonials. They believed the theory. They had built their commercial identities around the proposition that their products worked, and they had accumulated enough, apparently confirming evidence, the customers who got better, who came back to buy more, who told their neighbors, to maintain that belief against the evidence that was also available, if less prominently displayed, the customers who did not get better, who could not come back, who could no longer tell anyone anything. What is most instructive about the history of frontier medicine is not the scale of the harm, though the scale was genuine and significant. It is the mechanism by which harm was perpetuated in the presence of information that, in a different institutional context, should have been sufficient to stop it. The information was available. Patients were dying under treatment. Physicians who paid close attention to their outcomes could observe that certain treatments were associated with worse results than withholding treatment entirely. The physiological effects of aggressive bleeding and purging were observable at the bedside. The deaths attributed to cholera treatment were, in some cases, plainly the deaths of dehydration accelerating beyond what the disease alone would have produced. The information was there. What was absent was the institutional structure that would have forced that information to be heard and acted upon. The professional accountability that would have created consequences for practitioners whose outcomes were consistently poor. The comparative research that would have established, through documented cases, which treatments helped and which harmed. the regulatory environment that would have required patent medicine makers to demonstrate safety before selling their preparations to the public. These structures, peer review, comparative clinical research, regulatory oversight, professional accountability, are not glamorous. They are not the frontier. They are the slow, unglamorous work of building institutions that force accurate information to have consequences. And their absence on the frontier did not create freedom, as the frontier mythology often suggests. It created a context in which error could not be corrected, in which bad practices persisted indefinitely, in which the people who most needed protection, the sick, the injured, the frightened, the trusting, had none. The frontier doctor riding between settlements, with his bag of bleeding instruments and his bottles of mercury compounds, was not a villain. He was a man doing what his training told him to do, in conditions that gave him no reason to question that training. The villain, if there is one in this story, is not a person. It is the absence of the structures that would have forced the question. The physicians who eventually changed American medicine did not do so through inspiration or through individual genius. They did so by creating slowly and with great difficulty the institutional structures that the frontier had lacked: standardized medical education with consistent quality requirements, clinical research that documented outcomes systematically and forced comparison between treatments, professional licensing that created accountability for practitioners, regulatory oversight that required evidence of safety and efficacy before a treatment could be sold or recommended. These changes took decades. They were resisted at every stage by practitioners who were comfortable with the existing system, by commercial interests that profited from it, and by patients who had grown attached to treatments that had been presented to them as effective for so long that they had become part of their understanding of how health and illness were. The lesson is not that the frontier doctors were bad men. The lesson is that good intentions, genuine expertise, and sincere commitment to helping people are not by themselves sufficient to prevent harm. They are necessary, but not sufficient. What is also required is the institutional environment that forces practitioners to encounter accurate information about their outcomes, that creates consequences for error, that builds in the corrective mechanisms that individual human psychology, with its tendency to confirm existing beliefs and resist disconfirming evidence, will not supply on its own. This lesson, drawn from the examination rooms and the bedsides and the trailside graves of the American frontier, has not become less relevant with time. The tendency to confuse confidence with competence, to mistake the absence of accountability for the presence of freedom, to trust sincerity where evidence is what is actually needed. These are not 19th century problems. They are problems that appear wherever the institutional structures that force honest accounting are absent or weak. The graves are still there, along the trails and beside the abandoned settlements, in the dry ground of the American West. The wooden markers have long since rotted. The names, where they were ever recorded, exist in journals that few people read. The circumstances of the deaths, what treatment was given, by whom, on what theoretical basis, with what result, are mostly unrecorded. But the pattern is recorded in enough diaries and letters and medical journals and court records and census data to be unmistakable. The sick who came to the frontier doctor in good faith, who trusted the man with the bag and the certificate, who received the treatment that his training had taught him to give, and who died in numbers that a more honest accounting would have recognized as the cost of knowledge that was wrong and confidence that was absolute. The frontier asked of its people a particular kind of courage. The courage to go where nothing was established, to build where nothing had been built, to trust where trust was all that was available. That courage was genuine, and it deserves its place in the historical record. But it deserves to share that record with a different kind of truth. That trust, given in the absence of accountability, is not simply generous, it is dangerous. That the man who says he knows how to help, in a context where no one can verify the claim or measure the outcomes, is not the same as the man who actually does, and that the distance between those two men, a distance that was geographical on the frontier and is institutional everywhere else, is measured, in the end, in lives. The light is going out across the plains. The doctor's wagon moves between settlements in the dark, the bag swinging with the motion of the horse. The next patient is waiting. The confidence is intact. The question that the frontier never adequately asked, remains unanswered in the dust behind the wheels.